Welcome to another episode of American Drug Talk, sponsored by Accredited Drug Testing, the nation's leading provider of drug, alcohol, and DNA testing. Now here's your host, the president of Accredited Drug Testing, Jim Greer.
Welcome to American Drug Talk. I'm your host, Jim Greer, president of Accredited Drug Testing. Today's episode of American Drug Talk will be titled DOT Testing, and our guest is Brian Stearns. Brian is the DOT specialist at Accredited Drug Testing. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Glad to have you. Today's episode is going to deal with DOT testing, also known as regulated testing. And I believe you're the DOT specialist at Accredited Drug Testing.
I am.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your job and what it entails on a daily basis as the DOT specialist?
On a daily basis, I deal with a lot of regulations that the DOT puts in place to make sure that everybody in a safety-sensitive position is up to par and doing their job and performing in a drug-free environment.
I see. And as the DOT specialist, do you supervise the other employees of Accredited Drug Testing when it comes to DOT testing?
I do. In the scheduling office, I am the supervisor there, and I do watch over and give them the knowledge that they need to be able to give those tests and perform their duties.
I see. Well, good. Well, you know, there's a lot of discussions about DOT testing. Sometimes people know what it means, sometimes they don't. We had John on our last episode, and John talked about Department of Transportation testing. But give me an idea of who is regulated by the Department of Transportation, and also what is, in fact, the regulation that covers the drug and alcohol testing program?
Well, first to start with, the regulation is 49 CFR Part 40, which regulates the drug testing for the safety-sensitive positions.
Is that, when you say safety-sensitive, is that the position the employee holds?
Correct.
I see. And that's a DOT term.
And that's a DOT term. You have different agencies. You have the FMCSA, which is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration.
Now, who might that be?
That's your truck drivers. That's actually the biggest industry that we have right now. There's about 800,000 regulated companies that are out there. Well over 1 million drivers that are regulated under the DOT
Over
Part 40.
1 million drivers in the United States.
Correct. You also have the FRA, Federal Railroad Administration, FTA, Federal Transit Administration. That's your buses and your subways.
Public transportation.
Correct. You have your FAA, which is your Federal Aviation Administration, your airline pilots and stuff like that. You have your Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration.
We talked about that in our last episode. Apparently that's becoming much bigger because of the Keystone Pipeline potential.
Correct.
And are those mostly western states?
It is for right now. Yeah, a lot of western states coming down from North Dakota, South Dakota, California, and stuff like that. You have your United States Coast Guard that used to be regulated under the 49 CFR Part 40. As of 9/11, they're not regulated under it.
They're not part of DOT.
They're not part of the DOT, but they still run and operate underneath that because it is a good system to have.
I see. So the United States Coast Guard still follows Part 40?
Correct.
I see, even though they're not part of
Correct.
DOT
They find
anymore.
it that it is a good system to be regulating under the Coast Guard, so they do that. And that's your merchant marines, captains of ships, and stuff like that.
Well, that's interesting. So there's, under DOT, the Department of Transportation, there's Part 40, but then those agencies you described, do some of them have regulations that are unique to that particular agency?
So they do. They have a lot of different regulations. For instance, your truck drivers fall under Part 382. That regulation states and keeps them implemented in place because different agencies have different rules and regulations as far as other things involved with these.
Specific to their particular operation, I guess.
Correct.
So you might have, as an airline, some additional regulations regarding drug testing that maybe a truck driver may not have.
Exactly.
But they all operate under, I guess you could say, the mothership, which is Part 40.
4940, yeah.
I see. Well, let me ask you this. When it comes to DOT drug testing, and that's regulated, so that's a very specific type of regulations regarding drug testing.
Correct.
That might be different from a private employer.
Correct.
What type of drug test does the DOT require?
Well, as of right now, they have a 5-panel DOT drug test that they use. It has amphetamines, cocaine, marijuana, PCP, and opiates in it. They're looking right now to go towards more of an expanded opiates because of the epidemic that we're facing in the United States.
Right.
But as of now, since the early 90s, it's just a 5-panel DOT.
But I guess DOT is looking because of what's happening with the opiates.
Exactly.
A lot of people out there using opiates that they may not have prescriptions for.
Exactly.
Or they might be using a little too much of it than
Correct.
what they're prescribed. So DOT is looking at expanding that drug test to include many more opiates.
Exactly.
Okay. So right now it's a 5-panel. Is it a urine or a hair test?
It's a urine.
It's a urine.
It's just a standard 5-panel DOT urine.
I see. Are they looking at going to possibly a hair test too?
They're looking into it, but again, it's it takes a long.
It's government.
Yeah,
it's government. I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a question about a drug test, a DOT regulated drug test. What type of tests are there? I know there's a pre-employment drug test.
Correct.
But if you're regulated by DOT, is there something else you have to do beside a pre-employment drug test?
Well, every person in a safety-sensitive position is required to have a pre-employment drug screen on file. They also have to be in a consortium. Consortium is another one of those words for the government uses, which means random pooling. At any time, they can be chosen from a random pool, which means they have to go in. We pull quarterly. It just keeps everybody on their toes to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing within the regulations. That'll govern and regulate that type of testing.
So when someone, truck driver, gets his pre-employment drug test to be a truck driver, he's not done. He has to join a random testing program.
Yeah, consortium membership.
I see. Does everybody do that?
Not everybody. And not a lot of people even know what it means to be in a
I see.
consortium. So we have to walk them through that.
But if DOT found out that a regulated company wasn't requiring their employees to be in a random testing program, I guess they could get in trouble?
It could be a fine. It could be up to $10,000 each time.
Wow, that's incredible. I did actually read one time, a couple of years ago, of a DOT regulated company that was fined over $100,000 for not having their required employees in a random testing program.
yeah.
So when you have a pre-employment drug test and then they have to be in a random testing program, is the term DER, which ties in with Part 40, what is a DER?
DER means designated employee representative. That's the individual who's in charge of regulating the drug testing and removing safety-sensitive position individuals who don't comply with those rules.
I see. Now that's somebody that works in that particular company.
That's a person who's not in a safety-sensitive position, a secretary of some sort, or somebody in the office.
A manager.
Exactly.
So a DER is someone that is in that company, that regulated company, who's responsible for the drug and alcohol testing program.
Correct.
And when you say remove that safety-sensitive employee, what do you mean by that?
If they happen to have drugs in their system and they pop positive on a test, they need to be removed from that position because they can no longer perform it
As a safety-sensitive
Exactly.
employee. So like a truck driver, an airline pilot who had a positive test would have to be removed.
Exactly.
Are they removed immediately, or can they wait a few days?
No, immediately. You can just imagine if you're, getting ready to get on a plane and a pilot has a drug test and pops positive, they're not going to let him finish that flight and go to where he needs to go.
I hope not.
He has to be removed immediately because he's not within his regulations and he can cause harm to a lot of other people.
So a DOT drug test is not only a regulation that you have to comply with, it's a public safety issue.
Exactly. It's in place for the people.
It's in place for the people.
Exactly.
The safety of people out there throughout the country.
Mm-hmm.
So the DER is responsible for managing the company's drug testing program. I guess you have many DERs that work with your company, accredited drug testing?
Yeah, we do. A lot of DERs actually call in and ask me a lot of questions because the DER is a very important position, and at the same time, a lot of the people that are put in the DER's position don't know the regulations of 49 CFR Part 40.
I see. So they call in and ask questions, you help them out.
Exactly.
So every company needs to have someone responsible for that position that's
Yes.
regulated. Right?
Yep.
I see. So like in the private sector, it could be the office manager. The non-regulated sector, it could be the office manager. But DOT calls it the DER, the designated employer
Exactly.
representative. I see. Well, let me ask you another question. When you say DERs may not know the regulations, give me an example that a DER might call you and ask a question about. What would be an example of that?
It could be anything. It could be a simple thing from, I have 2 new employees that have to be put into a consortium. How do we go about that? Or what is a consortium in itself? If they have a random test, can it be counted as a pre-employment? No, it can't be. It has to be a pre-employment test on file.
I see. The company has to have
Exactly.
that on file.
Yeah.
So a random test and a pre-employment test is two different types of tests.
Yeah, 2 different things.
It's all regulated by Part 40, but you can't use one for the other.
Exactly.
So you
Yep.
get those kind of questions by a DER.
Yep.
I guess they call you about a positive test or maybe a diluted test. What should I do? Do you find that a lot of DERs don't know what to do if there's a positive test or even if there's a specimen that's diluted?
They don't. A lot of people ask me, I actually had the other day, an individual asked me, the driver popped positive on a test. He's out right now driving a load cross country. When he gets back, that's okay if I take him out, right? No. Immediately you have to find out where that employee is and he has to be removed from that safety.
They have to
safety
send
center.
someone there.
Exactly.
Find the truck,
Immediately.
get him out of the truck.
Immediately.
That's the DER's
It's just
responsibility.
Immediately.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this: as the as the DOT specialist at Accredited Drug Testing, what steps does the company take, and what steps do you personally take to make sure that you're familiar with the regulations so that you can help your clients?
Constantly reading books. There isn't a time where I never have my nose in a book. There's a lot of regulations that need to be covered, and I have to be able to know each and every one of those. They also change a lot, so you have to be on top of that. I go to conferences constantly. I just got back from New Orleans. I went to an FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, where we did a lot of classroom stuff. It was 3 days long. All day long I'm in classes and I'm speaking to individuals who actually work in higher up positions for those.
In DOT.
Exactly. I have another one in about 2 weeks that I'm going to. It's the DAISHA, the Drug and Alcohol Testing Industry Association. So I'll be going to that conference as well. So it's just constant information that I'm learning about.
Daily, you're trying to keep up with the
Every day,
regulations.
every day.
So, and you really, from a daily perspective, need to be knowing the changes that are out there occurring.
Correct.
Which brings me to one question I have. Medical marijuana, there's 23, 24 states now that allow medical marijuana, a few states that allow it recreationally. A lot of people think if they have a medical prescription or a medical card for marijuana that that gets them past a positive drug test with an employer. How does DOT feel about medical marijuana?
Well, you have to go back and look. It's a state law that's being passed. It's not a federal. DOT falls under federal law. It's still illegal under federal law.
It's a Schedule I drug.
Exactly. Yeah. So therefore, you can't do marijuana, use the marijuana product if you are a federal employee, which is DOT regulated. So
It doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter.
So if you test positive for marijuana in your system and you're a DOT regulated employee, a safety sensitive position, it doesn't matter how many medical cards you have, you're still in violation of Part 40. Is that
And
correct?
you're removed immediately.
And you're removed immediately. No exceptions.
No exceptions.
Have you heard of any potential changes, or is DOT pretty strong on
DOT
that?
is going to stick with that.
I see. I understand. Well, you said yourself it's a safety sensitive issue for the public.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of questions about marijuana out there and how it impairs someone. So I personally wouldn't want someone using marijuana that's going to fly my wife or my family somewhere, or a big truck driver on the interstate.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, Brian. You certainly provided us a lot of good information about the DOT regulations. What do you see is the biggest challenge in the nation's drug and alcohol testing industry as it relates to other drug testing companies out there and just people in general that are affected by Part 40? What's the biggest challenge out there that you see?
It's pretty much knowledge. Other companies don't give you the knowledge. I don't even believe they have DOT specialists. You need to have your individuals who are in the safety sensitive positions and your DER, your designated employee representative, to be learning and know what they're regulating. Mm-hmm. You can't put a person in a position who doesn't know what they're regulating.
What they're supposed to be doing.
Right.
So you think the biggest challenge out there among other drug testing companies is some of them, certainly not all of them, but many of them simply don't know the DOT regulations, and if they don't know the regulations, how can they help their clients?
Exactly.
So, and accredited drug testing certainly, and you as the DOT specialist, you feel that, I assume you feel that that's something that makes accredited drug testing stand out?
Oh, of course. I mean, like I said before, these regulations are put in place for the people. So it's my job, and accredited drug testing knows that and understands that. So we get as much knowledge as we can to put that implement in place.
And from your perspective, is there any difference in DOT regulations to a small company or a large company, or is it all the same?
It's all the same. DOT has strict regulations. Doesn't matter if you're an owner or operator driving your own truck, or if you have a company that has 2,000 trucks on the road.
Regulations are regulations.
Regulations are regulations.
I see. Well, Brian, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching another episode of American Drug Talk. Today's topic, of course, was DOT drug testing. We certainly learned a lot from Brian about the regulations that govern DOT employers around the country. I learned something. I hope you did too. And I hope you'll tune in next week for the next episode of American Drug Talk.